Hi, and welcome to my submission for Cloudspokes Challenge 3254, which is the AWE Guide Me Wizard. So first of all, I'll give you a functional overview. So going to my Salesforce environment, once you've installed the unmanaged package, the URL for which should be included on the submission, you can go to this Build Formula Example tab. What I've created is a very simple Visualforce page demonstrating how to tie in the component that I've created. So what we have on this page is a simple select list which has a few SObject names in it, as well as an invalid SObject name, which is this one, service request. And we also have a field into which the result of the wizard will be written, and we have the link which will launch the wizard. So let's show it in action. So click on the link, and what you'll get here is a pop-up, and the pop-up will be seeded with the fields and relationships of the root object that you selected from the list on the Visualforce page. So these are all fields and relationships for the account objects. Now you've got two choices. You either choose a field or a relationship. If you choose a field, then this little box here will appear, and it will tell you which field you've selected and give you the option to accept. If you choose a relationship, and you can see what options are relationships because they're designated with this sort of greater than symbol. If you choose that, then instead you'll get another select list which contains the fields and relationships for the SObject of the related object. So in this case, created by is pointing to user, so these are fields and relationships of user. Now you can continue to expand relationships. So say if I select contacts, then the next select list that's visible is for contacts, fields and relationships, and you can keep expanding them this way, and the pop-up will just expand over so you can scroll across. Now in theory, it can display any number of relationships here. Now I'm sure obviously when you copy the value back into the field in the Visualforce page, you'll probably hit a limit there, but within the pop-up itself there is no limit, at least that I've managed to hit. If you select the field, so in this case it will show you that the formula in this scenario is created by contact account master record .name. If I was to hit accept here, then that formula is written into the field on the main Visualforce page, included in the curly brackets with the exclamation mark. If I was to reopen that pop-up, then basically it resets it, and I would have to select a new value. However, if I click close or the little X symbol, effectively that's cancel, and it doesn't overwrite the value that I've already selected. If I was to select an invalid object, I'll show you how the exception handling works. So launch the pop-up, and what you'll see here is the error that's returned from the Apex controller in red at the top. So this is an example of a sort of out-of-the-box exception whereby the SObject named, in this case service request, doesn't actually exist. I've also added some custom exceptions that I'll go through when I get to the code walkthrough. But effectively you can close this and obviously change it back to a different value. So how does this all work? So let's go to the code for this page. So as I described it, we have a select list with 4 options. The fourth one, which is for service request, was invalid. We've got the input text fields, which is where we write our formula to, and we have the component. So the component takes 4 attributes, and it's designed to be easy to be used. So the first 2 attributes, the first one, root object field ID, this point is the ID of the field from which you retrieve the SObject name. In this case, it's a select list, but it could equally be a free text field if you want it to be. The main thing is that you need to give that field an ID, and that ID needs to be passed to the component. We then got a formula field ID, so that works pretty much in the same way. It's not expecting a value in this field this time, but it's going to write the output from this component into that field. So again, you need to give that field an ID, and you need to get past that ID into the component. The last two attributes are optional. You've got select element size, and this basically controls how many rows are visible in each select element. The default is 10. We also have open pop-up with button. So going back to the page quickly, you can launch the pop-up either via a link or a button. In the example I've got here, it's a link, but the default is actually a button. So going back to the code here, the fact that I've set this to false is why that's rendering as a link instead of a button. So next step. So that just before I move on, that should be pretty easy to tie into the example Visualforce page that you attached to the challenge. So yes, let's go to the component, see how that works. So obviously we've got the attributes being passed in at the top, as well as the controller. Attributes being stored on that controller. The pop-up itself is implemented using jQuery UI, so we've included the scripts and style sheets, and there's a static resource included in the package. We've then got the button or the link, and the open pop-up with button attributes basically controls which of those is rendered. Got the pop-up itself, so it's just a set of div tags and containers. So we've got the exception container, we've got a pop-up header, which basically gives the description that you see here. It's custom label, so you can obviously control what's written there if you want to. We've got a container, which is the main body of the pop-up, which contains a select container and a formula container. We've got some pop-up buttons. Then we get to the JavaScript, which basically is where all the legwork of this component is. Various constants declared at the top. Global variable used for the formula. And then we get into the functions. So we basically initialize the pop-up so that by default it's hidden until the open pop-up link or button is pressed. We've then attached some code to each of the buttons or links that can be clicked on to make the pop-up visible or to accept a formula. When the pop-up is launched, it'll call this initialize pop-up, which basically clears the pop-up of any previous values, so resets it to just the root select element, populates it with the fields and relationships of the selected root objects. Next thing you'll probably do is actually select an option from that root list, and that would call this get child select options method, and it'll do one of two things, because you've selected either a field or a relationship. If you've selected a field, then it will update the formula in the formula container and make that visible. If you've selected a relationship, then it'll create a new select element, give it a new ID, and it will populate that with the fields and relationships of the related S object. So how does this work? So we've got two methods that can remotely call code on the Apex controller. The first one populates the root object with its fields and relationships, and to do that you basically need to give it a root object name. So this is an S object such as account. We've also got populate child select, so this takes in a relationship. So this is dot notation, so in this case something like account dot created by is an example of a valid relationship that would return some options. As you'll notice on both of these we've got a bit of exception handling, so that if any problems occur when calling that method, the exceptions are written into the exception container element. We've got a few kind of helper methods. I won't go into these in too much detail, but they basically help out with the displaying of information on the pop-up itself. So let's go to the controller. So the controller basically has two real purposes. First of all, it stores the attributes of the component. It also has a custom class, so this probably requires a bit of explanation. So I created a custom class to return the select options to the component. The reason I didn't use the base select option class, or the one provided natively, is that for some reason when it returned the object to the JavaScript, it was returning a string array rather than an object array, and that presented a problem because it was only returning the actual values and not the value and the label. So I was forced into creating a select option, custom select option class. Pretty much offers the same functionality. I also added a sorting algorithm onto it, so that any lists of this object could be sorted alphabetically. We've then got some custom exceptions and messages for those exceptions. So invalid relationship syntax, so if for any reason we try to retrieve fields relationships for a object dot relationship that doesn't kind of follow this syntax of object dot relationship, then we'll get an error. Another restriction is that you can't retrieve relationships fields for relationships that point to multiple objects. So an example of this is on, say, the task S object. The who ID can, I believe, point to different objects. I think something like contact or opportunity. It can be either of them. This component only supports relationships that point to one object. We've also got relationship does not exist, so if for any reason they provide a valid S object but the relationship doesn't exist, then you'll get this exception. We've got two methods, both of them are available for remote calls. The first one returns relationships and fields for a given object. If it's a relationship, then basically what it does for the label is it strips off the ID from the end of the label and appends a greater than symbol. If we want to retrieve options for a relationship, which is the second method, and first of all we just do a quick check to make sure that the specified object relationship matches the expected pattern, and if it does, then we pass the object name relationship into two separate parameters, and we basically look for a match in that S object. If we find a relationship that matches the one named, then we also just check to make sure it's only pointing to a single object and not multiple objects. And if it's only pointing to a single object, then we basically return all the options and relationships for that object. If it got through this entire block of code without returning anything, then we throw an exception, which is basically saying the relationship does not exist. So that's basically the walkthrough of the controller. We've also got some test class logic, basically for positive and negative testing. So positive test walkthrough, just checking that we can retrieve relationship and field information from an object and its first tier relationship objects. Negative test, checking that what happens when we pass in an S object that doesn't exist. Negative test for passing an invalid object relationship format, and various formats that don't work. And we also a negative test for object relationship that does not exist, and a relationship for a multi-object. I think that probably covers everything, but obviously if you've got any questions, feel free to send me a message on Cloudspokes and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Hope you've enjoyed my solution. Thanks a lot.